In this lesson, we will learn a few different ways to troubleshoot issues when your footage is too long or too short. Okay, so I want to go ahead and first talk about what you do when your footage is too short. So come over here and we'll grab this first clip that you see there, the hierarchy 3, and we'll just drag that onto our timeline. Now, whenever I'm very first starting out here, and I'm wanting to decide how long this piece of footage should last. Let's say I want it to be shorter, maybe only last 4 seconds instead of 5. I can either decide to change the entire duration of this clip or simply trim it. So if I come in here and just grab the edge of that and pull that back to my current time indicator, that's going to end right there around 4 seconds. But I miss out on that last piece of the footage. If I drag through there, you can see where she completely exits our frame. Now, depending on whether or not that's vital to the story I'm telling through editing my footage together, that's going to really just be up to me if I can afford to lose that. Now, usually this is going to be the first method that I would choose whenever I'm trying to get a piece of footage to land in a spot before I start changing the duration of anything. But let's say that it's really important for my shot to show her exiting off of this frame, but I only can afford for this shot to last for 4 seconds. So now what I'm going to do is a stretch. So let's talk about what that is. Anytime you speed up or slow down an entire layer by the same factor, it's known as time stretching. So that means all across this layer, it's happening equally whenever I stretch it. Now, when you time stretch a layer, the audio, the original frames in that footage, and any keyframes that we may have set on this layer are going to be redistributed along that new duration. So you really only want to do this whenever you are maybe not doing it over very long of a duration. So let's talk about kind of what that means, and I'll go ahead and show you how to stretch this piece of footage. The easiest way that I like to do my time stretches is simply by opening up the stretch column right here on the timeline. So I'm going to come over here just right where you see this parent column. We'll right click that, go to columns, and the one down at the very bottom is going to be the stretch column. So if you click that, it's going to open up this extra column on the timeline for us. So I can stretch either longer or shorter, just depending on which direction I drag that value. So I want this to only last for 4 seconds, so I'm going to drag that backwards, and that's sitting at 83% of that original 100% of its duration. So now if we watch a little RAM preview of this, we see that she's moving just a little bit faster than she was originally, but I still see all of that shot. And 83% really isn't much of a stretch. So I'm really only working in there just a few frames that are being condensed into this new duration. Now, if I only needed this clip to last something like 1 second, so maybe I would pull that way down there, that's sitting at about 21%, this is going to start to look not realistic at all. So maybe if you wanted sort of a fast forwarding kind of look in your footage, this might be what you would want to go for. But if you want to do something realistic, you probably don't want to stretch it quite that much. So it looks like about 83% still looks realistic. Now, what if we want to go the other direction? What if we want it to take longer or more time on our timeline? And really, before, when we had it set to 100%, it was almost about 5 seconds long. So let's say now we want it to be 12 seconds long. I'm going to stretch that all the way out. That's going to come up to 247% of that original duration. And I'm just going to do a RAM preview so we can watch this through. This is starting to look really slowed down, and she almost looks kind of choppy, because one of the issues that happens whenever you stretch your footage beyond what it was originally intended is that you're really just trying to create frames that were never there in the first place. Now, this shot that we're using is pretty conducive to this. We're not getting any kind of really strange looking choppy motion. It's a little bit choppy, but other things, maybe like if it was a plane flying or something like that, will start to look really strange. So let's grab a clip that is maybe not going to cooperate quite as well with this. Grab that bike ride.mp4 and drag that onto your timeline. And I'm going to come up here to my composition settings, and let's make our duration, instead of 12 seconds, I'm going to bring that up to 25 seconds. We'll stretch that up there just so we can see that whole area. And now let's just go ahead and watch what this clip looks like at its normal 100% duration. It looks pretty good. You can kind of just notice the speed that that's traveling at. So let's say we want this to last a little bit longer, and we use the same method that we did for our last shot. I'm just going to stretch that all the way out there to 25 seconds, and that's stretching that to 209%. So it's a little bit even less of a stretch than the piece of footage that we were using earlier where we had a real person. Now this starts to look really choppy. This looks very slowed down, and you can really tell in the way that this little pedal is moving around. It almost just feels like it's moving in increments instead of a fluid circular motion. So as we kind of talked about earlier, the reason why this is happening is because After Effects is trying to create frames that never existed for this piece of footage. Now there's something that we can add to this clip that's going to give us just a little bit better of an interpolation of those frames, and that's called frame blending. So that's going to be a switch that you find down here on your timeline, and it's located right under this little switch that looks like a piece of actual footage that would be on film. So if I go ahead and check that, that's going to give me this default type of frame blending. And I also need to turn on my frame blending for all my layers. So much like motion blur, you have to turn on the switch for the layer and then the switch that enables it for all your layers. So now we can go ahead and watch this through. And this particular type of frame blending is going to be the first kind of frame blending that After Effects offers, called frame mix. Now frame mix takes less time to render, and it really just kind of mixes what you have from the previous frame and the next frame together. So that's why we get this kind of little haloing effect that you see kind of there in between. So sort of just this area here that you almost looks like the pedal has a different opacity and we're seeing it twice. Now for this piece of footage, the frame mix itself doesn't really look that bad. Now the next type of frame blending that we can use is simply by clicking that switch one more time, and now you'll notice that the line changes from that kind of dotted left slanting diagonal. So now it's going to slant to the right, and it's going to be stroked all the way through. So now we can watch this type of frame blending and see our different result. This looks maybe just a little bit more natural, and you almost have even a little bit more of a fluid motion with this type. And because it's such a simple sort of graphic that we're watching animate here, it's almost even hard to tell a difference between these two clips. So let's take a look at a clip where maybe we can see a little bit better of a difference between these two types of frame blending. So I'm going to come up there and grab my world bounce clip, and we'll drag that onto our composition. I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the little eyeball switches for those first two types. Now I'm going to stretch this up to maybe right in there around 14 seconds, and I'll go ahead and do a RAM preview of this just so you can see a quick clip of how this is supposed to look just with the stretch and no frame blending at all. So this looks like it's moving pretty quickly. And so if you wanted to keep this from looking like it was dropping any frames, you would maybe want to add some frame blending. So just to push this a little bit further, I'm going to stretch this out all the way. So we'll bring it up there all the way to 25 seconds, and that's going to put it at 339% of its original duration. So this starts to really look choppy. You can kind of see a little bit better now. It really feels like we're dropping some frames there. So let's go ahead and turn on frame blending. I'll just go ahead and click that, and you can already see that haloing we get with the pixel motion type of frame blend looks pretty bad. So if we watch a quick RAM preview of this, we see that that starts to really look strange and sort of gives the effect of almost double vision because it's trying to blend the previous and next frame together. And because we have so much motion in our footage and so much motion blur in that original clip, it's really having a hard time doing that. So now let's see what happens if we come in there and try to turn on the other kind of frame blending, which is going to be pixel motion. So I'll go ahead and turn that on, and we'll do a RAM preview. Now you can see already that this is taking longer to render than our last clip did. But you can also see that there's some really strange effects happening around the edge here. Some really bizarre artifacting that happens. And this is due to this geometric pattern that we have here. It's due to the motion blur that we have in our original clip, and also just that we have stretched this a lot farther than it ever was intended to be, just far beyond its capacity. It's coming up here to 25 seconds, and that's just too far to stretch a piece of footage and expect it to look perfect. So if we watch this through, we get almost this heat distortion kind of look whenever we have this sort of frame blending turned on. So you want to definitely watch out for which kinds of clips you're using that frame blending with. This is not going to be one that works for. Now there's another thing that I can do for this particular clip to change up the way that its frames are being interpreted, and that is by the interpret option I have over here in my project panel. Now this is only going to be available to clips that are sequences. So over here you see we have a PNG sequence for this world bounce, and our other types of clips were MP3s. So I'm going to come back in here and turn that stretch back down to just 100% so it doesn't have any kind of stretch on it whatsoever. I'm going to turn off all my frame blending that I had on earlier, and we'll delete these other two clips off of our timeline. So we're just kind of starting fresh here. Now I'm going to come up here to my composition settings, and so far I've been working at 24 frames per second, but let's say I'm going to turn that down to 15 frames per second. And 15 frames per second is actually what you're watching this video at. So this is going to be a lot more realistic than maybe what we've done so far. So you would be getting the results on your computer that I'm getting, but not the ones that you're necessarily watching. So as I scrub through this, you can see that this looks a lot faster, and that's because of the rate that this clip is being interpreted at. We're watching this with a 15-second frame rate for our whole comp, but the clip itself is not being interpreted back at 15 frames per second. So let's come up here to our clip in our project panel. We'll right-click that, go up to Interpret Footage, Main, and we see that the default here to the assumption that our frame rate is 30 frames per second. So let's change this to 15, just like the frame rate of our comp, and we'll say OK to that. And you see that automatically now we get all this extra time for that clip. So I'll go ahead and drag this out to the edge there, and we'll do a RAM preview of this. And after I just let a few more frames of this render, you'll be able to see that with this new duration, it's lasting a longer amount of time than we originally had. Originally we were at about 7 seconds, and now we're at 15, now that we've reinterpreted this with a lower frame rate. So now this looks pretty close to what it looked like originally. It's just lasting for a longer amount of time. So this is probably a little bit smarter way to interpret this type of footage than trying to stretch it and use frame blending. So just kind of as a recap here, we learned that whenever we're using that stretch, it doesn't work well if our whole frame is moving, like this particular clip is, and it doesn't work very well with geometric or intricate patterns or something that has been stretched far beyond its original capacity. And it also doesn't play very well with motion blur. So anytime you're using stretch and frame blending together, those are the things you want to look out for in your footage. It does work well with live footage, and it works well even if the footage has to be longer than it was originally intended to be. And it works best when you have a single subject moving kind of on a static background. As we saw in that first clip, we have the woman moving from one side to the other. There's not a lot of motion in that shot once we start speeding her up or slowing her down. So in this lesson, we learned that there are a few right ways and definitely some wrong ways to make a footage clip longer or shorter.